Tonight, someone you know is going to think about death. Maybe it's already you. And the moment that thought arrives, something strange happens inside you. A tightening in the chest, a sudden urge to look away, a quiet voice that says, "Don't go there." You've been trained to treat death like a door you're not supposed to open. But here's what nobody tells you. Your ancestors didn't just open that door. They walked through it. They sat with it. They built entire worlds around it. And the real story of what ancient humans did when someone died is far stranger, far more intimate, and far more human than anything you've been told. Let's start with something that will immediately reframe everything you think you know. For most of human history, death was not an event. It was a relationship. The body of someone who died was not removed, cleaned up, and sealed away within hours. It was kept, touched, talked to, carried, in some cases, lived with for months. This is not a fringe behavior from an isolated culture. Archaeological evidence from across Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia shows that our earliest ancestors treated the dead as participants in the community, not as something to be disposed of, but as something to be negotiated with. And when you understand why, you will never think about your own grief the same way again. The oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate burial comes from a cave in South Africa called Rising Star. In 2015, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team discovered the remains of Homo naledi, a species that existed roughly 300,000 years ago, long before modern humans as we know them. These were not fully modern minds. Their brains were about 1/3 the size of yours, and yet, deep inside that cave, in chambers that could only be reached by crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body, someone had placed the dead. Deliberately, repeatedly, over time. The question that shook the entire field of paleoanthropology was this. If a creature with a brain that small was already performing intentional burial, what does that tell us about the relationship between intelligence and the awareness of death? The answer changes everything. It suggests that the impulse to do something with the dead, to mark their passing, to give it meaning, to refuse to simply walk away, is not a byproduct of sophisticated civilization. It is something older, something wired into the social animal long before language, long before religion, long before the concept of an afterlife ever formed in anyone's mind. The ritual came before the explanation. The behavior came before the belief. Now move forward in time to the Neanderthals. For decades, the scientific consensus was that Neanderthals were too primitive to grieve, too cognitively limited to attach meaning to death. Then, the excavations at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan changed everything. Archaeologist Ralph Solecki, working in the 1950s and 60s, found the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals buried together. One of them, now called Shanidar 4, was surrounded by dense clusters of pollen from 8 different flowering plants. Solecki concluded that flowers had been placed on the grave. The idea that Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers sent a shockwave through the scientific community because it implied something profound. They mourned, they marked, they cared. Later, researchers questioned the flower interpretation, suggesting the pollen may have arrived by wind or by burrowing rodents. The debate continues. But here is what is not debated. The Neanderthals at Shanidar were intentionally placed in the ground, positioned carefully, sometimes with tools or animal bones arranged nearby. Whether or not there were flowers, someone chose not to leave them where they fell. Someone stayed, someone did something. And in that act of staying, in that refusal to simply move on, we see the earliest architecture of what we now call grief. But burial is only one piece of the story. In many ancient cultures, the dead were not buried at all. They were kept above ground. In Borneo, the Toraja people of Sulawesi, whose practices stretch back thousands of years, kept deceased family members in the home for weeks, sometimes months, feeding them, talking to them, including them in daily life. The dead person was not considered fully dead until a funeral ceremony could be performed. Until then, they were referred to as someone who was sick or sleeping. Linguist and anthropologist Roxana Watterson documented how the boundary between the living and the dead in these communities was deliberately kept permeable. Death was not a wall, it was a membrane. Think about what that means for a moment. In modern Western culture, you are encouraged to move through grief in stages, to process it efficiently, to reach acceptance and return to productivity. The body is removed within hours. The funeral happens within days. The expectation, spoken or unspoken, is that you will eventually close the door and walk back into ordinary life. But the anthropological record suggests that for most of human history, grief was not a problem to be solved. It was a process to be inhabited. The dead were kept close not because ancient people didn't understand death, but because they understood something about loss that we have largely forgotten, that the relationship doesn't end when the body stops moving. It continues, it changes, but it continues. And this is where the science of modern grief psychology crashes directly into ancient practice in a way that is almost impossible to ignore. In 2021, psychologist Mary Frances O'Connor published research showing that grief activates the brain's reward system. When bereaved people were shown photos of their deceased loved ones, the nucleus accumbens, the same region that lights up for food, sex, and social bonding, became active. The brain was still seeking the person, still reaching, still expecting a return. O'Connor described grief as the price of love, because the neural pathways built by attachment don't dissolve at death. They keep firing, they keep looking. And what your ancient ancestors were doing, keeping the dead present, talking to them, including them in rituals, was not superstition. It was, in a neurological sense, exactly what the grieving brain needs to do before it can slowly, gently begin to reorganize. They weren't holding on out of ignorance. They were holding on because holding on is the first stage of letting go. Now, let's go even deeper, because the ancient relationship with death didn't stop at the body. Across dozens of prehistoric cultures, the bones of the dead were not simply left where the body decomposed. They were collected, curated, rearranged. Archaeologists have found mass bone deposits at sites across Neolithic Europe where the remains of hundreds of individuals were carefully sorted. Skulls in one area, long bones in another, smaller bones grouped together. This is called secondary burial, and it was not random. It was intentional, repeated over generations, suggesting that the community returned to these sites, interacted with the remains, and maintained an ongoing relationship with their dead long after the flesh had disappeared. At Çatalhöyük, one of the world's oldest known cities in what is now Turkey, people buried their dead directly beneath the floors of their homes. They slept above them. They cooked above them. They were born above them. Anthropologist Ian Hodder, who has led excavations there for decades, found evidence that families sometimes reopened old graves to retrieve skulls, which were then plastered and painted and displayed in the home. These were not trophies. They were relics. They were a way of keeping the ancestor present, of making the dead a visible, touchable part of the ongoing story of the family. Your great-great-grandmother's photograph on the wall is not as different from this as you might think. The impulse to keep the dead visible, to refuse their total erasure, runs so deep in the human animal that it appears independently across cultures that had no contact with each other, across continents and millennia, in rainforests and deserts and Arctic tundra, in civilizations that worshipped completely different gods. This kind of convergence in human behavior is not coincidence. It is signal. It tells you something true about what you are. You are a species that cannot simply let go. And perhaps more importantly, you were never supposed to. Because here is the counterintuitive twist that modern psychology and evolutionary anthropology are slowly arriving at together. The ancient practice of maintaining a relationship with the dead, talking to them, keeping their objects, visiting their graves, including them in decisions, is not a failure to accept loss. It is an adaptive behavior. It is the mind using memory and ritual to slowly, across time, transform an acute wound into a carried presence. Grief researcher Dennis Klass spent decades studying bereaved parents and discovered that the healthiest outcomes were not found in people who successfully let go of their child, but in people who found a way to maintain what he called a continuing bond, an ongoing internal relationship with the deceased that evolved over time but never fully disappeared. Ancient humans didn't need a researcher to tell them this. They already knew. They built it into the architecture of their lives, into their floors, into their caves, into the flowers they may or may not have placed beside a body in the dark. So tonight, when you find yourself talking to someone who is gone, out loud or in your head, at a grave or in a car or in the space between sleep and waking, know that you are not being irrational. You are not failing to move on. You are doing something your species has done for at least 300,000 years. You are keeping the relationship alive in the only way that remains available to you. You are doing what humans do, and that strange tightening in your chest when someone asks you not to go there, not to think about death, not to sit with it, not to let it be present, that is the sound of something very old being told to be quiet. Your ancestors never listened, and because they didn't, you are here.